Teams 14 through 10, guys, are going to be really fun to talk about today from this AVCA poll back from August 16th of 2021. Because in my honest opinion, any of these teams could easily at any time be in the top 10, maybe even top 5 at some point this season, mostly because a lot of these teams, they're really good teams. They have a lot of playoff experience under their belts. And some of these teams are actually, they could potentially win it all just based off what they've done in the past, who their coaches are. And so these teams are going to be really fun to talk about in today's video. But with that today, guys, I ask that if you enjoy this content that you please like and subscribe to this channel, as every like and subscription that we have helps grow this channel to be able to keep talking about the game of volleyball. And with that today, guys, we're going to start off with number 14, Oregon. Number 14, Oregon, is going to be a very interesting team to watch this season, and I believe the more I talk about it, you're going to probably agree with me as well. Last season, Oregon went 15-5 last season, and they went 14-4 in their conference. Some key matches from last season: they lost one and won one against, at the time, number 19 UCLA. They were able to play USC twice, and both of those sets went to 5, which they won both times. So this team can compete when they need to. They were supposed to play number 7, the University of Utah at the time, but both of those matches were canceled. And then they lost one and won one against number 7, Washington. Then in the playoffs, they were able to beat Notre Dame in the second round of the playoffs. And then they ended up playing Purdue in the Sweet 16, which they lost. And from there, they pretty much got eliminated. What makes this team so interesting this season is, at least doing my research currently at this time, Oregon is one of the youngest teams potentially starting this coming season. And I say potentially because they might change their lineup, but if they were to stick with their lineup from what they had from Purdue, this is what they currently have right now from their lineup from last season. You're looking at least 6 sophomores who are starting, at least if they keep their 6-2 rotation, which I'm not too sure if they're actually going to keep the 6-2 rotation for them this season. That's kind of a topic that could discuss a little bit later about Oregon. But they at least had 6 sophomores starting when they were running a 6-2, with 2 juniors returning and 1 senior. Now, Oregon has to make that decision on whether or not they want to keep running a potential 6-2 offense that they were running against Purdue. I highly doubt it. I believe they can start running a 5-1 if the team's as talented as I think they are. But running a 6-2 is also the coach's decision in the end as well. And there's advantages to running a 6-2. Potentially you have more offensive power, especially with a really, really young team like this. Or maybe this is the season where they run the 5-1 because they have a team that has more experience under the belt. This is a team that a lot of coaches should keep an eye out on, because depending on what system they run could potentially determine how deep of the playoffs they make. But they're at least one of a very, very young team still. And obviously things can change based off incoming freshmen and maybe other players improve from the other age groups, but it should be interesting to see how Oregon performs this season. So key matches that a lot of people should look into. They play Rice on September 2nd. They'll play Penn State on September 10th. And then they play Minnesota on September 11th. Then in their season, they're actually going to start off by playing, at least on the ranked teams for the top 25, the University of Utah on October 3rd and October 29th. Stanford on October 10th, and then later on November 4th. Washington on October 14th and November 21st. UCLA on October 22nd and November 14th. And finally, USC on October 24th and November 12th. In general, like I said, I think this is going to be a very interesting team to watch. I do not expect them to run a 6-2 this next coming season like they did against Purdue in the playoffs, but you never know. And because of how young this team is, and they're not the only young team on this list, I believe, today, but in general, just based on how young they are, you could see a team with last year's experience that has youth on their side still. And if they can make a deep run into the playoffs, that means by next season, when they're potentially mostly juniors, Oregon could be a very scary team going forward. It just all depends on who's improved, what their coach decides to run for an offense. But I would keep an eye out for Oregon this season because Oregon potentially is going to be a threat in the college land scheme for the next couple of years. But even this season, they're potentially a threat in the making just based off what they currently have for youth-wise as a team. I mean, they made the Sweet 16 with this squad, and they were mostly freshmen last season. That should tell you enough about who Oregon is currently as a team. Louisville is in at number 13 this season for the AVCA coaches poll. And last season, Louisville went 15-3 overall, and they went 12-2 in their conference. Some key matches to note from their last season: they lost to Notre Dame, and then the second time they were supposed to play them, that match got canceled. Then they lost to Pittsburgh, and then were able to beat Pittsburgh once. They then played Florida State and beat them, and then they also played Georgia Tech and were able to beat Georgia Tech. Then in the playoffs, they were able to beat the University of San Diego before losing to Washington. Louisville, this season, they have, from their last match against Washington, they have at least 6 of their 7 starters coming back from their roster. And so you just have to fill in the one key piece that was missing. And most of these players are pretty experienced at this point. The youngest player on the team is one sophomore who's a starter on the outside, but the rest of them are mostly seniors, juniors, even fifth-year seniors, at least this coming season for this team. Some key matches to watch for them this season. They play Purdue on September 10th, and then they play Kentucky on September 15th. Then they play Nebraska on September 18th, and then they play Florida State on September 26th. Then they start playing Georgia Tech on October 3rd and November 12th. They play Pittsburgh on October 24th, and then later and on November 24th, they'll play Pittsburgh again. And then they play Notre Dame on November 15th and November 26th. Louisville this season, I think a lot of Louisville fans, based off their experience, this team could potentially make the playoffs just based off experience alone and how this team has performed in the last season. But that being said, it's going to be curious to know with one key piece missing from their lineup against Washington, if that's a huge factor or not. I don't expect it to be a huge factor, but you just never know in the game of volleyball. I think by October 3rd, after they play Georgia Tech, I think most Louisville fans will get an idea of where their team is at and potentially if they can compete or not. If we're going based off experience from last year, Louisville could make it to the third round based on the fact that they have been to the second round and are a more experienced team than they were last season. But if we're doing it based off where they could end up in the rankings, because like I said, this season's going to be completely different come playoffs time, maybe they get eliminated in the second round too. Who knows with Louisville, but Louisville fans, you'll get an idea by October where your team stands and how they can compete or if they can't compete at all. And so Louisville fans, it's going to be interesting to see how your team does this season. Like I said, my prediction, if they do make it and do make a push, I think third round is very conservative for them because I think they could do it. Just based off the experience that they currently have as a team and who's returning for them for this coming season. Coming in at number 12 for this list is Penn State, and I have to say you can never count Penn State out just based off their coach alone, okay? Russ Ross has done a lot for Penn State. In fact, for the longest time, Penn State was a huge threat in the NCAA tournament, and I think, if I remember correctly, they won the title like 4 straight years in a row. So don't ever count Penn State out in general. But that being said, though, Penn State has been pretty quiet for a while, and I don't know how much longer they're going to be quiet, but it should be interesting to see Penn State this season. But last season, Penn State went 10-6 overall, and then they went 9-5 in their conference last season. Some key moments from Penn State last season was they were able to beat Illinois twice. And the only reason I'm bringing up Illinois is because some years Illinois is really, really good at volleyball and other years they're not. I remember, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe even 3, if my memory serves me right, Illinois had a really, really fun match to watch when they played against the University of Utah. University of Utah ended up winning that match in 5, but the year prior to that match, they had made it to the Final Four. So always keep an eye out for Illinois as well. But we're talking about Penn State right now. So they beat Illinois twice. Then they lost to number 5 Minnesota twice last season. Then they lost to number 19 Ohio State twice. And then they lost one and won one to number 11 Purdue last season. And then they were supposed to play Wisconsin, but both of those matches were canceled. And then when they were supposed to play Nebraska, both of those matches were canceled as well. And then in the tournament, they were able to beat North Carolina A&T. And then in the second round of the playoffs, they ended up losing to number 4 Texas in the regional semifinals. Now, I had just mentioned earlier that Penn State can always be a threat. I mean, last season doesn't really give justice to Penn State, and especially what they're capable of doing at times. But Penn State should be on the lookout this season due to the fact that their entire lineup is coming back, and I'm expecting their head coach, Russ, to be more ready for this coming season, especially since they do have probably what I would consider a very tough schedule in the making, just based off who they play on certain nights. For instance, even though this match has already happened, on August 27th, they played number 24 Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech fans, Penn State fans, you should let us know in the comments below how that match went. Then they play Oregon on September 10th, followed by playing up Stanford on September 11th. Then they play Ohio State on September 26th, and later on in the season on November 21st. And then they play Nebraska on October 8th and November 19th. That Nebraska match should be a very interesting matchup because that matchup is always, it's like almost watching a chess match, but in volleyball version. Because both of these coaches, they know each other very, very well. They know their strategies. And so that's going to be a really interesting match to watch. I'd highly suggest if you guys have time on October 8th and November 19th to watch it, because it will give you an idea of how these teams could play in the playoffs if they make the playoffs. Then Penn State plays Purdue on October 17th, and they also play Minnesota on October 22nd and November 26th. Then they also play Wisconsin, and that Wisconsin match is on October 23rd. And then they play Illinois on October 30th. And like I've said, I'm curious to know how Illinois is going to be this season as well. And we'll probably cover that in more detail in a later video for another time. But that is another match that could potentially be interesting because we don't know how Illinois is going to be this season. But the Minnesota match, too, would be a really fun one to watch when Penn State plays them. It's another coach's chess match in the making because they know each other very well. And obviously the Wisconsin one and Ohio State would be just as big as well. Penn State, like I said, could be fun to watch because their coach, Russ, he's a really good coach and he knows how to coach his teams and make them really, really good. And even though Penn State hasn't done a whole lot as of recent, you can never count Penn State out completely from winning it all as long as Russ is there. So Penn State fans, like you guys are very lucky to have him as a coach. I expect things from them this season from Penn State, but at the same time, you just never know based off their schedule and who they play. But I do expect Penn State to battle for every single match that they play for this season. Let's talk about number 11. And like I've mentioned, not really mention, but you can't really talk about Penn State without bringing up Ohio State sometimes, and that's who we're talking about. And number 11, ironically, is Ohio State. Ohio State last season went 16-4 overall, and they went 15-3 in their conference. They were able to beat number 8 Penn State, and then when Penn State was ranked number 10, they beat Penn State again. They lost to number 4 Nebraska before they actually beat number 4 Nebraska from last season. Then they lost to number 10 Purdue twice last season. And then in the playoffs, they were able to beat Missouri in the second round of the playoffs before losing to Florida in the regional semifinals. Ohio State this season, from their starting lineup. They have everyone returning in a way, which is good for Ohio State. Pretty young team as well. One senior who's returning, but that senior is a defensive specialist or a libero potentially for this coming season. But something that I did notice with Ohio State when looking at their last match from the season was they couldn't seem to figure out who to put in based off of, at least for the hitters. So unless their hitters are struggling, like at that point in the season, it might be best to try to figure out who to go with at that point in the season. Maybe the girl was having an off night, don't know. But just looking at that, that's just my personal notes. Is I think at some point in the season you should know who your starting lineup should be, and sometimes you have to go with that gut feeling and just go with it, even if, I mean, they still lost in the end. And I know they were probably trying to win at the time, but it just seems like it might have been a struggle for that team when they played against Florida in the regional semifinals. They're probably looking for more offensive power, and they was struggling with two players at the time, it seems like. Some key matches to look for Ohio State this season. They have already played number 4 Washington. Washington and Ohio State fans, you should let us know in the comment section below how your teams did. Then they play Notre Dame on September 17th and 19th. They play Purdue on September 24th and October 15th. And then they play their good old rival Penn State on September 26th and November 21st. Then they play Wisconsin on October 22nd. They play Minnesota on October 24th and November 6th. And they play Nebraska on November 6th. And then obviously, like I had mentioned with the Penn State one, they play Illinois on November 14th. Ohio State fans should probably get an understanding of who their team is, potentially by the second time they play Purdue on October 15th. But like I said, most of their team is returning. Pretty decent young core still in the making. Probably still need to figure out how to get more offensive power from their players. Or maybe it was just an off match when they had lost. But Ohio State, if they make the playoffs, potentially second round again, maybe even push for a third. If they're really lucky, they can maybe go for a fourth. But I think the farthest they could potentially make is the third this coming season. It just all depends on what Ohio State's like this season and what the whole field looks like in general for the women's volleyball world in the making. So, but my prediction with Ohio State, I think Ohio State's going to make it to at least the second round of the playoffs. Not for sure, but there's a high probability that they could. And then hopefully maybe as they get better, be able to make a deep run into the playoffs. Finally on this list today for this video, guys, we're talking about number 10, Baylor. Baylor has been a surprising force as of recent because they've been pushing further and further into the NCAA tournament, and they are very, very close to winning it all. I honestly expect Baylor to be within the top 5 before the end of this season, at least in rankings potentially. But for sure, they're going to maybe be beyond the top 10, even though they're sitting at number 10 right now. And so, with that being said, guys, last season, Baylor went 20-7 overall. And then they went 13-3 in their conference. They lost to number 1 Texas in 5 sets both times. They had played them earlier in the season. And then when they played them about a month or two later, when they played Texas, they lost again, but this time they lost in 4 matches. So they can compete with Texas at times, but at the same time, sometimes they couldn't. I mean, taking them to 5 the first time and then only taking them to 4 the second 2 times gives me an idea of who Baylor is as a team for competing. They were able to beat number 10 Kansas twice last season. And then they were able to beat Pepperdine. And then into the playoffs, they were able to beat number 20 Pepperdine in the second round of the playoffs before losing to number 4 Nebraska in the NCAA regionals. Now, I don't expect Baylor to get eliminated this quickly. I think it was 2 years ago when Stanford won it all that Baylor did make it to the Final Four. And according to rumors on the street this year, this is probably the deepest team that Baylor has currently right now as a team. So they have a lot of depth on their team. And so I expect Baylor to make a huge push into the playoffs this year if they make the playoffs. And not only that, but from their last match when they had lost to Nebraska, they pretty much have their entire team coming back, and they're mostly fifth seniors and juniors. There's hardly any sophomores starting from this roster from last season, at least if they stick with what they had from the match against Nebraska. And if they have this depth like I keep hearing about, then they should be able to go deep and far into the playoffs and actually compete. Some key matches you're going to guys want to watch with Baylor. For instance, they've played Minnesota on August 27th and Wisconsin on August 28th. If you guys are fans of either of those three schools, whether it's Baylor, Minnesota, Wisconsin, let us know in the comments section below how they did so that we get a better understanding of how these teams are looking. They play Pittsburgh on September 4th, and then they play Florida on September 10th and 11th. They then play Rice on September 16th, and then Baylor does not play another ranked team at all in October, but they do start playing ranked teams again in November, which that is going to be very interesting, and I'll explain why in a minute. Because they play Texas on November 5th and November 6th, and I'm curious to know how they do against another team, which is not even on this list right now, but in the past this team has been interesting to watch, which is Texas Christian University. They play that team on November 12th and 13th. Now, the reason I find Baylor's matches interesting is because for the month of October, they have a very, very easy schedule, it looks like. Then come November, it's almost like as if they're preparing themselves to get ready for the playoffs, especially if TCU is actually a good team this year. That's even better for Baylor in the long run because they play Texas back-to-back nights on the first week of November, or at least within the first 7 days of November. And then they play TCU the last two. And if TCU is a decent team as well, that means Baylor is virtually getting ready for the playoffs. So they get to spend all of October when they're playing not like the best of teams, but they get to run more, I wouldn't say combinations, but they get to run more, well, I guess it is combination. They get to run different combination plays to see who works in what system, who can work with who. And then come November, they can then say, okay, we play Texas on these 2 days. Let's see if any of these two teams that we want to run or any combination of the girls we want to run could actually work if we make the playoffs. I'm very curious to know how this is going to work in Baylor's favor and in their favor, because it's a very interesting way to have a schedule where you don't play another ranked team until later into the season, and at the same time it gives you a chance to give other girls an opportunity to play if they're this deep team that Baylor I'm hearing about this season. So it's going to be interesting to see how Baylor does, and I would highly suggest guys keeping an eye out for Baylor, because this might be Baylor's year if everyone keeps saying how deep this team is and how good this team is becoming. So, but I also don't want to make too big of a prediction right now because I would like to see a couple matches before I can actually give my opinion on this. So keep an eye out for Baylor this year, guys. They have a very interesting schedule, to say the least, because I do expect them to make the playoffs. I do not expect them to not make it just based off how well they've been doing these last couple of years. So keep an eye out for Baylor this year, guys. They'll be fun to watch. That's it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed every minute of it, as I've enjoyed every minute of doing research for these teams and being able to talk about it today to you all. Like I've mentioned before, if you enjoyed this content, I ask that you please like and subscribe to this YouTube channel, as every like and subscription that we get can help grow this YouTube channel so we can keep talking about the game of volleyball. With that being said, guys, thank you for your time today. And as always, let's keep talking about the game of volleyball and let's enjoy the sport we love so much.